Mixing with Mike plugin of the week comes from the Plugin Alliance, the Lindell 50 series. This is going to be a features overview. There will be no audio in this video. There will be a separate video with audio examples if that's what you want to go to. So listen and watch knowing that it will only be information. All right, so disclaimer put aside. This is the latest release from the Plugin Alliance and Lindell, who gave us the 80 series, which was just a fabulous plugin that I love and use all of the time. And I have a good feeling that this one is also going to be a regular part of the rotation of console emulations that I throw into my mixing. What we have here is something that has a very similar setup to what you saw with the 80 series. We have an input section here, EQ section, compressor section, a gate section. I don't recall ever seeing an API gate. Couldn't seem to find one, but they created one here. I think that's like the Neve gate. And the fader, right? So we have the full signal path here that has been emulated. Now, what's cool about this, aside from the normal, things that you get with each of the channels, the A/B selection and all of that, the ability to turn off individual sections here or bypass them here, you also get more than one EQ. You get the 550A EQ, you get the 550B EQ, and you get the 560 EQ. So you have all three options available to you, which is amazing. What they've also done in here, and there are a couple options which we'll get into in a second. With the 550A, you get obviously the added high pass, low pass filter that sort of cut it at 50 hertz and 15K. So it's kind of a band pass filter, I guess. And but they give you extended frequencies. So normally I think you only go down to 50 on 550A, but they give you the extended frequencies that were added with the 550B. So you get kind of a little bit of the best of both worlds and some of the designs like that. So what you have is the normal proportional Q. All of the other frequency selection is as expected. But you actually have an option here to have variable gain. So rather than going to the stepped positions, you can actually go all the way in between, right, to all the graduations in between. There's an option here that allows you to, where the hell is it? It is up in here somewhere. EQ gain continuous, or stepped. So if we put it into the stepped position, then it will lock to stepped positions. So sorry, I missed that. I should have had that a little bit. That's the side chain, excuse me. And I'll get this straight sooner or later. Or continuous. So I set it up here for continuous, which actually makes it in many ways a bit more usable. And if you want to go traditional style, then you have that ability. The frequencies are not continuous. They remain fixed, so it's only the gain that goes plus minus that way. So you have all three options there. With the 550B, you get the shelving option for the high band and the low band, the separate in-out switch, all of that. You have a separate bypass. And there's a little microscopic thing here that says post, which will put the EQ post compression. So that will allow you to just rearrange the order, which is an option that would have been nice to have in the 80 series Lindell. All right, so we have that. On the compressor section, what we have are two options. The FET version, which is the original 525 API compressor. It was actually a FET compressor, not a VCA compressor. And it was kind of an interesting one because it has this feature called a ceiling. And the ceiling feature, what that allows you to do is it lowers the threshold while simultaneously raising the makeup gain. So it's this double feature. So as you actually go through and lower the threshold to get more gain reduction, you're simultaneously compensating for it with one knob. And that limits the amount that you actually have to adjust the input and output gain controls that are here. They've added in a couple of features like the wet-dry mix control. There's a high-pass sidechain filter that you can throw in there for running the filter on that for the FET circuit, detection circuit, basically. And then you have a fixed attack time, which actually is program dependent, but it's very fast, and something like 15 microseconds fast or something. You have two options here. You have a limiter option, which is 20 to 1, compressor option, which is 2-to-1. And then you can go through a series of different options where the release time can be 100 milliseconds, 500 milliseconds, 2 seconds, or 2.5 seconds. So you have all the different options there for different release times, 4 different options for release times. And there's a DS circuit. All this does, it doesn't make it exactly a de-esser. It won't respond that way, nor do I think it's fast enough to really respond that way. But what it does do is it actually applies into the detection circuit a filter that sort of band passes or filters out everything except for the area where you have sibilance. So it's just going to be more responsive to that area. And I'm not exactly sure if it's a band pass or what the exact design of that EQ circuit is, but it'll be more responsive to frequencies in that area. So it's not like it doesn't change the functionality of the compression. It's still a full frequency compressor. It doesn't multiband anything. It's a simple circuit. And this is as was in the original design. So it's pretty cool in that way. Otherwise, you have the VCA circuit. And the VCA circuit emulates the more modern mix bus version API, which is the API 2500, which came out in the early 2000s. So that was designed as a mix bus compressor, maybe mastering compressor. And that is just a stellar, like just an amazing VCA compressor. Really, really powerful. And this actually contains almost all of those features, all the same attack times, threshold, same ratio settings that you get there, same release time settings that you get there, although here it's variable, right? So you have the variable control. And then what we have here is the Nouveau filter, which is like a basically like a tilt EQ filter that's put into the signal path. There were actually 3 options on the original 2500. This gives you 2 of them, which I assume is flat and with this filter in of the thrust control is what it was called. You have hard and soft knee on the 2500. You have hard, medium, soft. Okay, but it gives you those 2 options, which is helpful. And then you have the feedback, feed-forward style compression. Fundamentally, the original VCA compressor designs and most compressor designs were feedback processors, meaning that the output of the compressor would actually feed back into the detection circuit. So it was a little bit slower, but also more responsive to the actual audio signal. If it was more sustaining, it would kind of maintain the compression a little bit longer. If it was more transient, it would release things faster. So you get a little bit, and mostly the way that I hear this and the way that it works is the feedback circuit will have a warmer sound to it, and the feed forward circuit without this in will give you something that's a bit more cleaner, more sharp, and more present sounding. And that's what you should listen for when you're using that. The link feature will link the left and right side by percentage. And this is really one of the more powerful options of the 2500. So normally you would get stereo and both sides, you would get 2 options. You would get them independent of each other completely, or you would get them 100% locked together. So what this does is when there's compression, and let's say a signal on the left side triggers gain reduction, both sides will have the same amount of gain reduction no matter which side triggers it. Okay, and they'll have identical settings. Here, you can link that by percentage. So if it's 100%, then or if it's 0, then you basically they're separated from each other. If it's 100% linked, then the gain reduction is identical on both sides. And sometimes you get a more open sound here, depending upon how stereo the input signal is, when you have it here than when you have it here. And then you get a percentage value in between. So you can get a little bit of the gain reduction applied to the other side, but not the full amount, half as much, if that's the case, right? So that's the basic part of the VCA circuit here for the compression. Very cool. Again, it has its own independent bypass circuit here. One thing before I just go to the gate is the input gain section. So this, I'm not totally clear. In the brochure, it says it's the mic preamp, and but then I see elsewhere it's the line preamp, and perhaps it doesn't really matter. But what you have is a input gain circuit here, and there's a feature here called Unity, and the Unity circuit allows you to adjust this gain. To my mind, what it does is to basically drive the input circuit more while maintaining the same output. So you get the different tonal coloration by driving the input more or less, and then it would allow you to always maintain unity gain. Now it says it maintains unity gain at the output, but it's not the output after everything. It's the output of the input section before you get to the EQ and compression. Because when I drive this with the unity, it affects nothing with the gain reduction. And if this output balancing was at the end of everything, that would not be the case. So that's just something to understand there. There's also a THD, which allows you to drive more harmonic distortion. I'm not exactly sure how these two differ in that way, or whether there's something that is missing from all of this. However, if you're not doing this, you could do it the other way, which is just hit the -20, drive a little bit more gain in that way, and maybe you need to adjust the gain anyway if the input signal is way too hot, and you could work with it that way. So you have the -20 thing. If the -20 and the unity are in, then this, I don't think this functions. There's also a high-pass filter. One of the things about the API EQs is that it doesn't have, other than the 550A, which has the high-pass, low-pass filter all bridged together into one switch at fixed frequencies. What they added in here is something that doesn't exist, which is, or at least on the API consoles from the 1970s, like the 2448 and those consoles. And it set at 80 hertz, but you can go from a range from 20 hertz up to 1 kilohertz, right? So you have that range built in there, and just a simple high-pass filter. I'm not sure what the order is. I didn't find any information. I wasn't able to find any information on it, but pretty much you either like it or you don't, and it's right at the input stage, which is typically where you put something like that. Otherwise, going through the circuit, selecting the different bands here, I didn't go through the 560 parametric EQ. It still has the same basic proportional Q characteristics, and this was an EQ that was also created, I think, in the early 70s or late 80s originally, and just gives a full parametric EQ that pretty much goes up octaves through the frequency spectrum if you follow it, and it's just amazing for guitars, and love it for great for like kick drum and snare drum at different times. It works incredibly well. It's a great option to have all the three of these available to you, and you'll kind of hear when we get to the audio examples how that works. All right, so let's power along over here. Next up is the gate section. So with the gate section, essentially what you have here is a range control, for the amount of total gain reduction. Okay, so that'll determine the vector, once you fall back below the threshold. There are basically two thresholds, and this is kind of confusing. The what they call the hysteresis control and on the threshold control. So essentially what you have is an open and a closed gate. And essentially Neve does this on their 88RS and all of their V series consoles. They did a very similar thing. And the basic idea is that you set a threshold for the gate to open, which is typically higher than the threshold that will close. And if you put it on something like a tom, for example, and you need to set the threshold somewhat high to get rid of bleed or get rid of false triggering, most of the time it will end up cutting off the sustain of the tom. So you can have it or set it so that the threshold for closure, right, for the gate closure, passes back through a lower threshold, and that differential between the open and closed threshold is set by the hysteresis. So if it's 4, then there would be a 4 dB difference between the open threshold and the closed threshold, and that's the primary thing that you want to get from that. So this was handy, especially for things. If you're going to go back to the analog days for reverb returns, where a lot of those old digital reverbs were quite noisy, and so you'd put like a soft gate on them. And having something like this, you wouldn't want to cut off the end of the reverb tail. So having this hysteresis control would allow you to set a threshold where it would open at a higher signal level, but you would get the full decay of the reverb or whatever it is before the gate closure started to happen. And then you get a release time. There's a fast and slow attack. but it is pretty fast. I mean, it's like 50 microseconds or 500 microseconds between fast and slow, so it's quite fast. And the expand is like a 1-to-2 ratio, and the gate is like 100-to-1 ratio or 1-to-100. It depends how you do the math or whatever. But this is like the expander is for softer stuff, where you don't want to hear the gate like really shut down on something. The gate is just like slamming down on everything. That's it. And then you can have an inversion. This is kind of an interesting feature. It's like a ducking feature. So it will actually shut down the signal when the threshold is exceeded. It'll do the opposite. And so if you set a range control, for example, of a couple of dB, you can have it duck something that is occurring every time it occurs and maintain what's left. And that actually comes in handy sometimes for certain things. So anyway, that's just a thought. Have that there. Release time. Again, it has its own separate in circuit. Up at the top here, what we have is the TMT section. So TMT is a tolerance modeling technology. So what BrainWorks has done with their consoles, and I guess this technology is licensed to Lindell, however that works, what we have is a emulation of, or a modeling of the variation of all the circuitry, percentage variation of all the circuitry that goes into a channel strip. And in the real analog world, no two channel strips or no two analog pieces of gear sound identical to each other. No two microphones sound identical to each other, right? And especially over time, they will degrade in different ways, and there will be more variance. They've formulated that with all of those circuits into a formula, and then you get a whole ton of emulations. I can't remember how many it was. Is it like 32? I think it stops at 32. Yes, it stops at 32. So you have up to 32 channels here, and then you have the ability to, by hitting the all button or 1, you could just go to random channels just on the 1, or you can hit the all button and it will kind of make all of them change at once. And I really love this feature. Except I wish it just had an undo. Maybe we could add that in. I don't know. Dark, can work with me a little bit. But aside from that, it's really amazing just having, even if you went through the channel strips and changed them, it just makes that subtle variation. And that subtle variation seems to create a nice depth and openness and separation of everything. Now to finish off, there's also here that there's a cut circuit, a cut switch, right? Normal cut switch, and a phase inversion switch here, which you get with all of the BrainWorks channel strips, and the Lindell ones as well. And then a fader, an output fader for makeup gain. Now, the compressor section here, both compressor sections do have their own makeup gains built in. So most of the time you're okay. It's usually the compression circuit that sort of gets in the way of things if you have issues on that end. All right, so a couple other things to go over here, and then we'll get to the audio examples video. One is the calibration. So with this, you can set a calibration setting. So if you always set everything up in your setup to -18, you can calibrate this to -18. And then once you do that, you could save that as a default, set it in all instances, and now that'll be your default setup. So basically that's calibrating the level going in and balancing on the output. And without getting into a whole long thing about that, whenever analog stuff integrates with digital stuff, you need some form of a calibration. And all analog emulations are done at a fixed calibration. When they feed their test signals out, if they feed out at a -18 signal strength, then the emulation is done and captured at -18 and received at -18. So that's all that this is setting up. And I have plenty of videos about that on my website about doing gain structure. Oversampling, this is great. I set up a 4x default, which is really great. That helps to eliminate some of the aliasing issues, but you could turn it off or selectively decide what you need it on. Again, any of these features you could set as a default and set to all instances. So some of these things, it's not like you have to go through one by one and do that. So they're very smart that way. Same with the noise. It's a pretty low-level noise. APIs are generally pretty quiet consoles. So you could set it there. That's on. And then there's clipping. Now, the clipping here with this, the original circuitry is a hard clipping. And what that means is that when signal goes over the capabilities of the hardware, and APIs are known for having a pretty good extended dynamic range in terms of the amount of signal you can feed in before you start to get distorted. But when it does pass through, does it clip hard like the original circuitry? Does it do it soft, right, which is an adaptation that's added in here? Or do you just turn it off altogether and let it be pure digital and let the overage sort of be figured out with the 64-bit processing, which means that nothing happens? I like the hard. I've gone through this with the 80 series. I went through some testing with this. Maybe I'll demonstrate a little bit of that just to kind of show you. And then once you kind of set that up, you can. Oops, hold on. I switched channels over here for a second. Once you set that up, you can actually save that as the default setting, so it'll always set up hard every time you load up a new channel strip. And that's pretty much it. You got zoom selection here, right? So you can zoom based on the size capabilities of your screen. The EQ's gain either being stepped or continuous. I went over that, and you can make one or the other default. And then you could have set up the external sidechain to feed the compressor or the gate. So this is dependent upon which DAW you're using. If it has sidechain capabilities, external sidechain capabilities, then that will show up, and it's in a checkbox here. It doesn't show up anywhere on the channel strip. Nice to have it like up here someplace where maybe you could select it, but that's all right. It actually it works really well, and then you just select the bus or whatever the input source is that you want to key it. And that's pretty much it. This is so far in my testing and running through it, and you'll hear it in the audio examples video that will follow this one. I have fallen very quickly in love. I was very excited when this came up in my email box. Downloaded it immediately, loaded it up, and after figuring out everything, I usually like to go through everything on my own before reading the manual, and then I go in, I read the manual, get all the details, figure out what I missed, and then I dive in and listen to it and see what it sounds like. Blood and guts. It always comes down to that. So, all right, that's it. That's our features overview. Let's get move straight on, and the video that follows this will be the audio examples video.